At 5 a.m. on July 7, 1944, Captain Benjamin Solomon crouched inside a medical tent on the beach at Saipan, listening to the sound of thousands of feet moving through the darkness. He was 29 years old, a dentist by training, a combat medic by necessity. 10 days earlier, he had volunteered to replace a wounded battalion surgeon. He had never treated battlefield trauma before this week. Now, 30 wounded Americans lay bleeding inside his tent, and less than 50 yards of open sand separated him from a mass of screaming Japanese infantry surging toward the American lines. The attack was the last act of the Japanese 43rd Division. They had lost 25,000 men in 3 weeks. They were starving, wounded, nearly out of ammunition, but their commander had given a final order. Attack at dawn. Kill 10 Americans each. Die with honor. Most carried rifles. Some carried only bayonets lashed to sticks. A few clutched rocks in their hands. They were told this was their final morning alive. Solomon's aid station stood just behind the forward foxholes near Tanapag village. 2 American machine gunners covered the approach. At 4:45, the first screams rolled across the beach. Moments later, Japanese infantry poured through the American lines like water through a broken dam. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry tried to hold. They had started the night with 1,100 men. Within an hour, 300 were dead or dying in the sand. The wounded came in waves. Men crawled through the tent flaps with their hands pressed against open bellies. Others staggered in, intestines spilling through shredded uniforms. Some were dragged in by friends who dropped them on the ground and ran back to fight. Solomon worked without pause. Clamp, suture, morphine. Next patient. He treated gut wounds, sucking chest wounds, shattered limbs. Blood soaked into the dirt floor, turning sand into mud. His boots stuck with every step. The tent filled with the smell of iron, cordite, and fear. Outside, the noise grew louder. Rifles cracked. Machine guns hammered. Grenades exploded close enough to shake the tent poles. Dust fell from the canvas ceiling, but Solomon's hands never slowed. He checked pulses, made decisions in seconds. Who could wait? Who needed evacuation now? Who would not survive the next 10 minutes? Then a Japanese soldier stepped through the tent opening. He walked past a wounded American and bayoneted the man nearest the wall. Solomon looked up, dropped into a squat, grabbed an M1 rifle, and fired once. The Japanese soldier collapsed. Solomon turned back to his patient. 2 more Japanese soldiers forced their way through the entrance. American rifle fire cut them down. Then 4 more crawled under the canvas walls, knives and bayonets in their hands. Solomon was alone. His medics were evacuating the wounded. Every able-bodied soldier was already outside fighting. The first attacker lunged with a knife. Solomon kicked it away. He shot the second soldier in the chest, bayonet the third through the ribs. The fourth came at him with a bayonet. Solomon's rifle clicked empty. He drove his head forward, smashing his skull into the man's face. Teeth and blood flew. The Japanese soldier staggered back. A wounded American on a stretcher drew a .45 pistol and fired once. The enemy fell dead. Solomon stood in the wreckage of his aid station. Blood everywhere. Enemy bodies on the floor. Wounded Americans dragging themselves toward the exit. Outside, the noise was getting closer. He made a decision. Solomon ordered everyone out. Walking wounded carried those who couldn't move. Medics lifted stretchers and ran as bullets snapped overhead. The last orderly glanced back as he fled and saw Solomon grab a rifle from a wounded man, check the magazine, and turn toward the beach. 30 feet from the tent, a Browning M1917 machine gun sat silent. The 4 Americans who had manned it were dead. Japanese soldiers were pouring past their position. Solomon ran to the gun, dropped behind it, and opened fire. The Browning was a water-cooled .30 caliber, weighing 41 pounds, capable of 450 rounds per minute. Solomon had trained on it years earlier, before the army decided his hands were too valuable for combat and forced him into dentistry. He fired in short, controlled bursts. The gun bucked. Brass piled at his feet. Enemy soldiers fell by the dozen. He was hit in the left arm. Kept firing. Hit again in the shoulder. Adjusted his grip. The body stacked in front of him, 15 feet away, then 10, then 5. He couldn't see past them. The water jacket hissed and boiled. Solomon grabbed the gun and dragged it backward, leaving a trail of blood in the sand. He fired again. More fell. Again the bodies blocked his view. Again he moved the gun. For times, he dragged that weapon to a new position. For times, the Japanese kept coming. As the sun rose over Saipan, the beach was piled with bodies, and Captain Benjamin Solomon was still firing. His war had just begun. On June 22, 1944, a Japanese mortar round slammed into the battalion command post. 2 Americans were killed instantly. The battalion surgeon was hit by shrapnel that shredded his leg. He couldn't walk. He couldn't operate. He had to be evacuated immediately. The battalion commander needed a replacement, someone who could perform emergency surgery under fire. Someone, said Benjamin Solomon. He was a dentist, but he had steady hands. He knew anatomy. He had taken extra medical training in Hawaii. And more importantly, he didn't panic. Solomon volunteered without hesitation. For the first time since the war began, he was exactly where he wanted to be, at the front. He set up aid stations just behind advancing infantry, often within mortar range. He treated sucking chest wounds, amputated mangled limbs, stopped arterial bleeding with clamps and bare hands. He worked while artillery walked closer, while dirt sprayed through tent seams, while rifle fire cracked overhead. The wounded trusted him. They called him Doc. They didn't care that he was trained to fix teeth instead of shattered bodies. They cared that his hands were fast and his voice stayed calm. The officers noticed too. They saw that Solomon worked faster under pressure than men who'd spent their careers in operating rooms. After 10 days, he had saved dozens of lives. He had lost some as well. The men who arrived too late, too damaged, too far gone. He didn't dwell on them. There wasn't time. Then came July 6th. Intelligence reported a major Japanese attack forming in the northern part of the island. The remnants of the 43rd Division were cornered. 3 weeks earlier, they had numbered 30,000. Now, maybe 5,000 remained. They were starving. They had no escape. And they were expected to die attacking. American commanders anticipated a banzai charge, the largest yet. Every unit prepared. Bayonets were fixed. Extra ammunition stacked in foxholes. Positions deepened. Fields of fire overlapped. Machine gunners checked their weapons again and again. Water jackets filled. Belts inspected. Nothing left to chance. That evening, Solomon's aid station sat 50 yards behind the front line, just 30 yards from the beach. A small canvas tent. 2 machine gunners assigned for protection. Inside, everything was ready. Bandages, plasma, morphine, surgical tools arranged neatly on a field table. Solomon expected maybe 20 casualties in the first hour. He had no idea what was coming. At 4:45 a.m., the screaming began. Thousands of voices erupted from the darkness. The Japanese hit the American line like a tidal wave, men throwing themselves forward, knowing they would not survive. And now Solomon was no longer in his tent. He was behind a machine gun, already wounded, already bleeding, already low on ammunition. The Browning M1917 was a relic of the First World War. 41 pounds empty, 93 pounds with a full water jacket, another 53 pounds for the tripod. A full setup weighed 146 pounds and normally required 4 men to move. Solomon was dragging it alone. The gun fired 30 caliber rounds, the same ammunition as the M1 rifle. Each round left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, lethal far beyond what Solomon could see in the dim light. And Solomon knew exactly how to use it. He had already repositioned the gun twice. Each time the body stacked too high, blocking his view. Each time he dragged the weapon backward, leaving blood in the dirt, and opened fire again. Now he moved it a third time. He grabbed the barrel jacket and burned his hands on superheated metal. Didn't let go. Hauled the gun back 10 feet. Dropped behind it and fired. The sun was rising. Now he could see them clearly. Japanese infantry in shredded uniforms. Some wearing only loincloths. Many already wounded. Bandages on heads and arms. Blood soaking through cloth. They came anyway. Solomon fired in short, controlled bursts. Traverse left. Traverse right. Each burst dropped 1 or 2 men. They fell in heaps. The next wave climbed over them, using the dead as cover. Some reached within 20 feet before the bullets found them. Solomon's left arm barely worked. The earlier bullet had damaged muscle or nerve. He couldn't lift it properly. He braced the gun with it anyway and worked the trigger with his right hand. More rounds hit him. One tore through his right thigh. Another punched into his lower abdomen. Another struck his chest. Each impact felt like a sledgehammer. His vision blurred. His lungs burned. He blinked, shook his head, kept firing. The American line was collapsing. 1st Battalion was overrun within the hour. 2nd Battalion fought hand-to-hand in foxholes. Entire squads vanished. Japanese troops reached the battalion command post, killed staff officers, seized radios. But the wounded were getting away. The men Solomon had evacuated were being carried toward the rear. 30 Americans, alive because Solomon had held this position. 30 lives bought with time. The Japanese commander had ordered his men forward at any cost. And they obeyed. Solomon checked his ammunition. Maybe 200 rounds left. He could see at least 300 attackers still advancing. The math didn't work. His chest wound was bad. Breathing rattled. Blood filled his lungs. He knew what that meant. He had treated enough men to understand. Minutes mattered now. He fired again. 3 Japanese fell. 2 kept coming. He fired again. They dropped. More replaced them. A bayonet thrust came from his left. He hadn't seen the soldier crawling through the bodies. The blade slid between his ribs. Solomon twisted, shoved the bayonet aside with his weak left hand, drew his .45 pistol, and fired 3 times into the man's chest. The soldier collapsed across the sandbags. Solomon dropped the pistol and went back to the machine gun. His vision narrowed. Darkness crept in at the edges. The gun steamed. The water jacket boiled. The barrel glowed. The belt ran out. Solomon looked down at the empty links. Looked up at the Japanese still advancing. He picked up the pistol. 1 shot. Another. 2 soldiers fell. A third leapt over the sandbags. Solomon fired his last round. The soldier collapsed onto him. The pistol was empty. The machine gun was empty. Solomon grabbed the machine gun by the barrel jacket and swung it like a club. The steel smashed into a Japanese soldier's face. Bone shattered. Teeth flew. Another came forward. Solomon was still standing. Solomon swung again. The steel smashed into the soldier's ribs. He heard bone crack. The man collapsed. Another came forward. Solomon tried to lift the gun again, but his arms wouldn't respond. The wounds were too much now. Strength drained out of him all at once. He dropped the Browning and fell to his knees behind the sandbags. A bayonet lunged toward his chest. He caught the rifle barrel with both hands and held it there. The Japanese soldier shoved forward. Solomon pushed back. His hands were slick with blood, his own blood. His grip slipped. The bayonet drove into his chest. 3 inches, maybe 4. He felt it scrape against his ribs. The soldier pulled it free. Thrust again. Solomon couldn't stop it this time. The blade went in. Came out. Went in again. He counted the impacts, then lost count after 6. Everything was getting dark. Cold. His legs stopped responding. He slumped forward, collapsing over the machine gun. His face pressed against the water jacket, still warm from the firing. It felt almost comfortable. He could still hear fighting, screaming, explosions. But it sounded distant now, like a radio playing in another room. Then the sound faded. Everything faded. The Japanese kept coming. They poured through the gap in the American line and reached the artillery positions. The gunners fought with pistols and rifle butts, hand-to-hand in the gun pits. The attack lasted 15 hours, from 4:45 in the morning until nearly 8 that night. 2nd Battalion took 83% casualties. 919 men dead or critically wounded out of 1,180. 1st Battalion lost nearly as many, but they held. The Japanese attack failed. By nightfall, the survivors were retreating north. Fewer than 500 remained out of the 4,000 who charged that morning. American troops retook the lost ground on July 8th. They found Solomon's body slumped over the machine gun. His shirt had been pulled up to his waist, likely by Japanese soldiers checking if he was dead, making sure, bayoneting him again to be certain. Around his position, they counted the bodies. 98 Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of the gun, piled 3 and 4 deep in places. The counting party followed the blood trail. They found where Solomon had moved the gun, once, twice, 3 times, 4 times total, each time dragging a 93-pound weapon while bleeding from fatal wounds, each time setting up and firing again. Captain Edmund Love, historian for the 27th Infantry Division, walked the site with the counting party. He saw the blood, the bodies, the empty belts, the spent brass scattered everywhere. He began taking notes immediately. This was a Medal of Honor action. No question. They examined Solomon's body. 76 bullet wounds. Multiple bayonet wounds. Too many to count precisely. The division surgeon estimated that 24 of the wounds were inflicted while Solomon was still alive. The rest came afterward. Love gathered eyewitness statements. Found medics who evacuated the wounded from the tent. Found soldiers who saw Solomon run to the gun. Found men who watched him fire into the attack. He compiled everything. Submitted the Medal of Honor recommendation up the chain of command. Major General George Greiner read it. Then read it again. Called in his staff. They discussed it for an hour. Then Greiner denied the award. His reasoning was simple. Solomon had been wearing a Red Cross brassard. He was a medical officer. Under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel were not permitted to bear arms against the enemy. Solomon had not only carried a weapon, he had manned a machine gun. Love argued that Solomon acted in defense of his patients, that he had removed the brassard before taking up arms, that the Geneva Convention allowed medical personnel to defend themselves and the wounded. Greiner would not budge. The recommendation was denied. Filed. Forgotten. The war went on. The 27th Division fought on Okinawa. More men died. Love kept his notes, kept the statements, kept thinking about Solomon, about the 30 men who lived, the 98 who died, the dentist who died alone behind a machine gun. After the war ended, Love tried again. In 1951, he resubmitted the Medal of Honor recommendation. He still had the files, the photographs, the witness statements. 6 months later, it came back denied again. This time, the reason was procedural. The deadline for World War II awards had expired, 5 years after the end of hostilities. Too late. Love argued that the original recommendation had been submitted during the war, that it should count. The Army disagreed. Case closed. He put the file away. Years passed. Korea, Vietnam. Uniforms changed. Tactics changed. Decisions did not. Solomon was honored in smaller ways. In 1973, the Army named a dental clinic at Fort Benning after him. A plaque. A brief summary. USC remembered him too. A display. Photographs. His dental degree. His captain's bars. But it wasn't the Medal of Honor. The decades passed. Then in 1995, an Army dentist named Colonel John King was researching the history of the dental corps, digging through old files. He found Solomon's case. He read the statements. Read about the machine gun, the 4 relocations, the 98 dead, the 76 wounds. And he realized what everyone else had missed. This story wasn't finished. Colonel John King couldn't believe what he was reading. This was a Medal of Honor action. There was no ambiguity, no missing evidence, no exaggeration. The witness statements were clear. The casualty counts were documented. The photographs existed. The timeline was precise. So King kept digging. He found the original denial from 1944, the Geneva Convention argument, the assumption that Solomon had violated international law by taking up arms. He found the second denial in 1951, the procedural rejection, the expiration of the award deadline. He found the attempt by the Surgeon General in 1969 and the quiet denial that followed. 50 years of rejections. King decided someone had to try again. At the same time, across the country, Dr. Robert West was working at the University of Southern California. An alumnus of the dental school, he was helping prepare a centennial history of the institution. As part of the research, he began compiling profiles of notable alumni. That's when he found Ben Solomon. West became fixated on the story. He read everything he could find. He asked why Solomon had never received the Medal of Honor. Someone put him in contact with King. The two men compared notes. They realized they were holding the same file from opposite sides of the system. They decided to work together. King brought military experience and access to Army channels. West brought civilian advocacy and institutional backing. Together, they believed the case could finally move. West contacted Congressman Brad Sherman, whose district included USC. He presented the evidence, the eyewitness testimony, the photographs, the casualty counts. Sherman agreed to help. This time, something was different. There was public attention. USC formally endorsed the effort. The dental school made Solomon's case part of its institutional history. Alumni wrote letters. Veterans organizations joined in. The story reached the media. Pressure mounted. The Army reviewed the case again. The Medal of Honor Board reconsidered the Geneva Convention issue. This time, They concluded Solomon had acted in defense of his patients, that he had removed his Red Cross brassard, that the conventions allowed medical personnel to use force in self-defense and in defense of the wounded. In 2001, Congress passed legislation waiving the time limit on Solomon's award. President George W. Bush signed it. The path was finally clear. On May 1, 2002, 58 years after Solomon died on Saipan, the Medal of Honor was presented in the White House Rose Garden. Dr. Robert West accepted it on behalf of USC's School of Dentistry. Veterans of the 27th Infantry Division were in attendance. Some in wheelchairs, some with canes, all elderly, all remembering Saipan. President Bush read the citation in full. It described the aid station, the wounded men, the Japanese soldiers crawling under the tent walls, Solomon kicking away a knife, shooting, bayoneting, headbutting, ordering the evacuation, manning the machine gun, dragging it 4 times while wounded, holding the position alone. 98 enemy dead, 76 bullet wounds. When Bush finished, he said Solomon was one young man who was the match for 100. The medal was placed in West's hands. It returned to USC, where it remains on display today. Ben Solomon became the 3rd dentist in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. The first 2 had earned it during World War I. He was also one of 3 Jewish Americans to receive the Medal of Honor for World War II. 2 other Medals of Honor were awarded for actions during that same July 7th attack. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, who manned a Jeep-mounted machine gun and fought until he was killed. Private First Class Thomas Baker, who refused evacuation, was propped against a tree with a pistol and was found dead the next day with 8 Japanese soldiers around him. Both received their medals in 1945. Solomon did not. He waited 58 years. Today, his grave at Forest Lawn Memorial Park bears a new marker. His rank, his unit, his Medal of Honor. Visitors leave coins on the headstone. Quarters, mostly. USC teaches his story to every incoming dental class. The Army teaches it to combat medics. Historians study that Banzai attack, 4,000 attackers, 15 hours of fighting, 83% casualties. Saipan changed the war. It brought Japan within bomber range. It led to the B-29 campaign. It led, ultimately, to surrender. Solomon died in the battle that made that possible. The men who fought there are gone now. The last survivor of that attack died in 2018. Only the records remain. And one final calculation. 30 wounded men. 1 dentist. Ben Solomon understood the math. And he accepted the result. 30 lives were worth more than 1. Benjamin Solomon had made that calculation repeatedly during the previous 10 days. It was part of his work. Who received plasma first? Who was evacuated immediately? Who got morphine and comfort instead of surgery? Every decision carried a cost. Every choice favored one life over another. This was no different. He knew the machine gun. He had trained on it for more than a year before the Army reassigned him to the Dental Corps. He knew how to clear jams, how to traverse the tripod, how to fire in controlled bursts to prevent overheating. The muscle memory remained, even after 2 years spent pulling teeth instead of triggers. He also understood the situation the moment he reached the gun. 4,000 attackers. A shattered American line. No replacement gunners. No reserves. No realistic chance of survival. The only unknown was time. How long he could hold. How many attackers he could stop. How much distance that time would buy for the wounded men moving toward the rear. Medical science can describe what was happening inside his body as he fought. The bullet wounds. The bayonet wounds. The blood loss. Hemorrhagic shock. Falling blood pressure. Rising heart rate. Narrowing vision. The progressive failure of organs deprived of oxygen. A human body carries roughly 5 liters of blood. Loss of 30% triggers shock. Loss of 40% leads to loss of consciousness. Loss of 50% is typically fatal. Solomon lost more than that. The evidence was in the ground itself. For distinct blood trails. For positions where the machine gun had been dragged backward and fired again. Each movement required lifting and pulling a weapon system weighing more than 90 pounds while wounded repeatedly. Adrenaline explains part of it. Pain suppression. Temporary strength. Focus. But adrenaline has limits. Those limits were closing fast. When the ammunition ran out, he continued with the pistol. When the pistol ran dry, he used the machine gun as a blunt weapon. When his arms failed, he fought with his hands. When his strength failed entirely, he was overwhelmed. The soldiers who finally killed him did so at close range. Bayonet wounds delivered repeatedly. Defensive injuries to his hands and arms indicated continued resistance even after collapse. Additional wounds were inflicted after death, a common battlefield response to ensure an opponent was no longer a threat. When American forces retook the position the next day, they found Solomon slumped forward over the machine gun. The blood trail suggested he had attempted to move it one final time and failed. Around him lay 98 Japanese dead. Captain Edmund Love, the division historian, documented the scene carefully. In his report, he noted that the blood patterns suggested Solomon had continued attempting to reposition the gun even as his strength failed. That image stayed with Love for the rest of his life. A dentist behind a machine gun. A medical officer who chose to fight. A man who violated regulations to protect his patients. That decision is why Solomon's recognition took 58 years. He was a non-combatant under the Geneva Convention. He wore a Red Cross brassard. He was protected. He could have withdrawn with the wounded. Regulations required it. Instead, he removed the brassard. That detail mattered. He did not fight as a protected medic. He relinquished that protection knowingly. He made himself a lawful target. He accepted the consequences. The Army struggled with that reality. Rules exist to protect medical personnel for good reason. Those protections save thousands of lives. But Solomon's situation presented no compliant option. His patients could not move fast enough. The enemy was too close. The alternative to fighting was abandonment. So he chose. Not heroism. Not glory. A calculation. 30 wounded men versus one dentist. That choice could not be reconciled easily within doctrine. It took decades for the institution to acknowledge that sometimes the correct action violates existing rules. Modern military training reflects that lesson now. Combat medics are trained in defensive force. Rules have evolved. They evolved in part because of cases like Solomon's. He never knew that. He never knew he had been recommended for the Medal of Honor. Never knew it had been denied. Never knew his actions would be debated for 6 decades. He simply did his job until it killed him. The men he saved knew. They went home. They told their families. They told their children that a dentist saved their lives twice. Once with medicine, once with a machine gun. They said he deserved recognition even when the system said otherwise. Those men are gone now. What remains are the records, the witness statements, the photographs, the citation, the medal displayed at USC, and the fact of the choice itself. Benjamin Lewis Solomon was born September 1, 1914. Raised in Milwaukee. An Eagle Scout. A dentist during a time of Jewish enrollment quotas. A soldier who wanted to fight. A medical officer who volunteered to serve at the front. A man in combat for 10 days. A surgeon for 10 days. A machine gunner for 15 hours. He saved 30 lives. He killed 98 attackers. He died alone behind a gun he was never supposed to use. That is not a story about breaking rules. It is a story about accepting responsibility when rules are no longer enough. And that is why his story still matters.